Hi, so this being Women's History Month, I thought I'd tell a little story about a woman from history. Not a famous person, not somebody who achieved massive things or performed a huge feat of heroism that I know of. Just somebody I came across in some old press cuttings. And it's a tiny event, but then I think history is made up of millions of tiny events, and they all go together to sort of shape the way things unfold. So, this is a story from 1939, and at the time in Britain, this is August, we're expecting the war with Germany to start imminently. Okay, and it's so sort of definite that civil defence has already been put in place. So that is to say, people doing things around the country that will support like emergency conditions, including air raid wardens or ARP wardens. And the subject of this tale, Mrs. Ida Walch, was one of these ARP wardens, and obviously a woman. So these are people now, unfortunately, they're probably, because of comedy, particularly a character in Dad's Army, they're sort of thought of as being kind of busybodies who went around telling people to put lights out, you know, as enforcing the blackout. But there was more to it than that, because when air raids actually happened, they were outside. You know, they were outside at the precise moment when, I guess, your instinct would be to be inside, or preferably in a shelter. So they're outside doing stuff to help people get to safety and stuff like that. So it's a role that was contributing to the war effort and helping to keep people safe. And yes, there were women. In fact, there's a storyline in a TV show at the moment, All Creatures Great and Small, about a woman being an ARP warden. So that's the sort of timescale building up to the war. ARP warden, and the place is West Hartlepool. So that's a town on the northeast coast of England, an industrial town. A town that had, during the First World War, so in living memory, been bombed from above from Zeppelins and shelled from battleships at sea. So people knew what it was like to have things blowing up in your town, which to me makes the whole being an ARP warden thing a little bit more sort of heroic. And in fact, the town and the whole area would be massively bombed during the Second World War. So anyone thinking this is something that might happen, because of its position, closer to Europe, being industrial, they were right. So that's one thing, hold that thought. It's also the year that a movie came out, Son of Frankenstein. Son of Frankenstein. So the another entry in the Universal Studios Frankenstein series of horror movies. Some think it's the last of the great ones. You still had Boris Karloff being the monster. Bela Lugosi was in it as well. Basil Rathbone was the title character. So that's a big movie, scary movie, that's about to come out in the summer of 1939. Now, cinemas at that time had to be very competitive because there were lots of them, and let's say you ran a town centre cinema that was a little bit more expensive than some of the cheaper sort of flea pits and so on. You know, you'd want people to come to see the film at your place. So the publicity stunt organised by a cinema manager, that was like a thriving thing. Sometimes you had tie-ins with local shops, you had perhaps people in costume wandering around town, elaborate displays put on in foyers or outside cinemas, even like live action, live little mini performances called prologues would happen prior to the start of the film. So all sorts of things happen. And one type of publicity stunt that was often used during the 30s, it always got quite old by now, is the lone patron. The lone patron watching the scary movie at midnight. So here's the way it worked. You, Mr. Cinema Manager, would get into the local press, probably for free, saying there'll be a prize, say a guinea, quite a decent money prize, for anyone who's brave enough to see the scary film on their own at midnight. And there's a competition, maybe it's just like a draw or whatever, to see who gets to be the competitor. And then there'll be rules about, they've got to stay sitting in the cinema. They can't run out. And you'd make out that it was possible that they might faint or suffer some sort of medical emergency. You could perhaps dress that up a bit by saying there's a doctor on standby, that sort of thing. So you make a big hoopla about this sitting through the thing. And basically, pretty unlikely anyone's not going to win, but maybe they wouldn't, in which case that'd be great, because it'd be, this film's so scary. The lone patron couldn't even make it to the end. Or they do, and they're rewarded with the prize. So, for instance, one cutting I found from earlier on in the 30s, a lone patron sees The Ghoul at midnight. Smart showmanship by manager F.M. Goodwin of the Court Cinema Darlington for The Ghoul, another Universal horror film, is having its own reward in the shape of capacity. Business this week. An advertisement was placed in the local press offering a prize of 2 guineas to the lady, not unusual to say it has to be a lady, who could sit all alone through a midnight performance of the film. Hundreds of replies were received for the challenge, and to decide which should be the lone patron, a draw was held on the stage. So lots of opportunities for publicity. It's going to happen. We're deciding who's going to do it. On the night of the screening, large crowds collected outside the Kinema. Which is interesting, that this was so interesting that people would wait outside to see what was happening. Sometimes they'd be like, we're posting bulletins while it's happening. And when the lady came out, she was cheered and carried shoulder high through the street. So that's how the lone patron works. And that was being done in West Hartlepool for Son of Frankenstein. So let me read the cuttings that I found about Ida Walch. So you got that? 39, Frankenstein video. Woman with steel nerve? ? Will a West Hartlepool woman manage to carry through the test which has been arranged in connection with the film Son of Frankenstein? Censor Certificate H, showing at the Picture House next week. The management have arranged to have a special private showing of the film and are awarding 1 guinea to a woman who will sit throughout the film alone in the theatre at midnight tomorrow night. She must not scream. Leave her seat. Take her attention off the screen.
You know what I've just thought of?
Or otherwise visibly display that she can't take it.
Look. I can't take it. Ah! Proceed.
A bulletin of the viewer's reaction is being posted outside the theatre at intervals during the test. From a large number of applications, the lucky woman who has been chosen is Mrs. Walsh, not spelling her name properly, aged 35, of an address in West Hartlepool. It is interesting to note that Mrs. Walsh is an air raid warden.
Right.
Okay, so that's the first cutting, saying it's happening. Then the following Monday, West woman wins. West Hartlepool women air raid wardens are made of the right stuff for any emergency. Judging by the display of nerve exhibited by Mrs. Ida Walch of her address, who sat through a private showing alone at midnight last Saturday night of the horror film Son of Frankenstein at the Picture House. Despite the fact that Mrs. Walch agreed She felt her nerves rather on edge from time to time. Throughout the tense moments of the spine-chilling film, she stood the test well, and having earned her guinea, was loudly cheered on leaving the cinema by the large crowd assembled outside. So hooray for Mrs. Walch. But that's not quite the reason I pulled it out of the archives. So turning now to Paul's ARP Warden wins horror film test at midnight. Same story, different paper. A crowd of several hundred stood outside Hartlepool Cinema at midnight on Saturday, after a woman sat alone inside viewing the horror film Son of Frankenstein. She was Mrs. Ida Walch. She'd taken up the challenge of the management that they would pay a guinea to any woman who could sit through the film at midnight with all the lights out. Well, because it's a cinema. Actually, Mrs. Walsh was not alone. Unknown to her, the manager and an ambulance man were inside the circle. Okay, so it's so scary we need an ambulance ready. Mrs. Walch is an air raid warden, and while shopping last week, heard a man who was discussing the management's challenge saying they should try it on the women air raid wardens. You'd hear plenty of screams then. Mrs. Walch got a cheer from the crowd when she came out. She said, I took objection to the remark about women air raid wardens. If I'd not been able to stick this test of mock horror, I should have handed in my air raid warden's badge because I should have considered myself incapable of standing the strain of war and real horror. So that's why I thought it was interesting, that she did it because of man saying, the women air raid wardens, they'll be screaming. So she wanted to prove that she had the right stuff. Plus, I just think it's so weird that on the eve of war, this movie that's set in a sort of fantasy Europe, with it a sort of Europe of folklore, the sort of towns with burgomeisters with lederhosen on, and a film that's quite camp as well as being sort of quite scary and gothic, you know, of all the things to be watching at that time for this purpose. So that is my woman of history that I wish to praise here in 2025. If there's any descendants of Ida Walch out there, that would be fantastic to hear from them. Okay, back soon with something else.
Hooray!